A new bill introduced in Parliament will allow the government to borrow funds for long-term infrastructure projects with stricter safeguards in place. And for more on borrowing to fund infrastructure projects, we're joined by Sumit Agarwal. He's a professor for finance, economics and real estate at the NUS Business School. Thanks for joining us, Professor. Firstly, allowing the government to spread out the costs of infrastructure projects across generations, how does that work?
Essentially, it makes sure that the cost is borne by all the generations, because the benefits of these infrastructure projects will also be borne by the future generations equally. So it is equitable and it's fair in that sense to both accrue the benefits and also accrue the cost of these across these generations. And that's how these bonds actually work and actually help spread out these costs over these generations.
So, Professor, talk to us about the manner in which these funds are being raised. What are the advantages of issuing securities bonds under Singapore's central bank instead of having individual agencies issue their own?
That's pretty much how the structure is set all over the world. Essentially, the central bank issues these bonds. In Singapore, it's done because there is an act that forces the MAS to issue these bonds because they want to create a national debt market. So, I mean, this is just a technicality on why MAS issues it versus government agencies. I think it's more efficient for MAS to do it than anybody else to do it in Singapore. It's a central organization that will then issue them, manage them, and keep track of these bonds. So I think it's just essentially all over the world, you don't see various parts of the government issuing their separate bonds. Unlike America, where some of this happens, where essentially you have these, rural bonds or you have these, municipal bonds, but most countries don't follow that structure.
The government says it will convert upfront spending on projects into depreciation over its lifespan. What do you think are the benefits of that?
So that makes sense because what is happening is if you actually show an expenditure upfront, what you are doing is you have a huge expenditure upfront, let's say of $20 billion or $30 billion to have an infrastructure project. But the benefits that you'll accrue of that will be over the next 20, 30, 40 years. So there will be a mismatch in essentially the revenue you're generating and the cost you're incurring. Now, the way they do the capitalization and the depreciation, it allows you for the revenue and the cost to match pretty closely, because the depreciation and capitalization allows you to have the cost of issuing this over a long time period as much as the revenue that will be generated from these projects. So this is more of a technicality again, because again, in Singapore, they want to have a balanced budget and they don't want to have taken on a huge amount of debt. By doing it in this fashion, it allows them to match this, and actually it works out better for the budget.
Singa also sets out some safeguards as well. There are borrowing limits, there are certain restrictions. Do you foresee any challenges, though?
Look, I think they have two limits, essentially. One is that the maximum amount you can borrow is around 90 billion. And the second limit is the maximum interest you will be paying on that is 5 billion. Now, the only challenge will be that if interest rates keep rising and they go above 5%, then essentially you're paying over $5 billion. And that is a constraint that the government has put on itself. So I don't foresee in Singapore interest rates to be rising. The reason they are issuing these bonds is precisely because of that, because they expect interest rates are so low, and so they think it's right and actually fair to go out and issue bonds rather than draw down on the strategic reserves of the government. So I don't see any issues coming forward. But who knows? I mean, in the very remote chance interest rates rise very high, this can be an issue. My probability of that event is very, very low.
Yeah, it's hard to predict the future, but just to talk about safeguards for a moment and what can be done to ensure that we don't overspend.
Yeah, so I think this $90 billion limit is a pretty good way to ensure that the government doesn't overspend, but also they have many other safeguards. One of the safeguards is they have to have a balanced budget. The other safeguard is that the debt service burden cannot be more than 5 billion. So there are many ways the government is tying themselves so that they don't overspend, which, typically governments all around the world, when they have a free rein, they will just go out and spend as much as they like. But here the government is focused precisely on infrastructure. They are also not just going out and spending, they're doing infrastructure development, which the benefits will be accrued over generations, and which is actually much needed in Singapore and any other country at this point.
Professor Agarwal, thank you very much. Sumit Agarwal, there, Professor for Finance, Economics and Real Estate at the NUS Business School.